Okay, so we'll get started. I'm Dr. Mark Poznansky. I'm based at the Massachusetts General Hospital. I have, with my team here, been organizing regular webinars to update the general public and our healthcare colleagues about the growing crisis with regards to healthcare itself in Ukraine, to bring people up to date. And we've been able to assemble eminent groups of Ukrainian physicians, scientists, and healthcare workers to help us understand the scale of what is happening and also what we may be able to do to help. I'm just sharing my slides here. I assume everyone can see them. Phoebe, is that a thumbs up on that?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have assembled a program. I'm just trying to flip through the slides here. So we'll actually move usual stuff here. Okay. Okay, we have the list of people speaking. I'll be introducing Dr. Melnichuk, who is a wonderful colleague of mine here in the Mass General Brigham system. She's a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and she'll be introducing the speakers today. And I just wanted to present a few slides just to put this in context. The group that we represent here is the Heal Ukraine group, which have members below, including these doctors and scientists working together to provide aid and information and educational materials to Ukrainians on the front line in the war currently. I would just want to emphasize to those on the call the scale of what is going on. Russia launched an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, its neighboring democratic nation, on February the 24th. And as you can see from the report from the Institute for the Study of War, where the front lines now are in eastern Ukraine, you can see that these are just colored areas that have been occupied now by the Russian army. But these military maps also belie the enormous scale of suffering that's going on underneath that sort of pale pink color, and also beyond into Ukraine and beyond the borders of Ukraine into neighboring nations like Poland and Romania, where there's been great influxes of refugees. So the scale of what's going on is to a former sovereign nation of 44 million people that has been invaded and now is suffering vast consequences to its populace of what is happening there. And these are the numbers. I include the ones from June the 8th, 2022, just up in the left-hand corner there to give you the scale of the refugee situation reported from the UN, and then in the larger numbers, what these have grown to since June. You can see from 4.8 million to 6.4 million refugees from Ukraine. Border crossings from Ukraine and other countries have all increased. These numbers are staggering in their scale and consequently have enormous impact on healthcare maintenance, and both in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. So really underlie the severity of what is going on in Ukraine itself and the invasion by the Russian army. And then the latest reports that I could pull up, not from May, I'm sorry, I should have updated that. This is from this month, both by WHO and Fox News, reporting between 434 and 869 attacks on healthcare facilities, 79 deaths of healthcare workers and patients, and multiple alleged violations of Geneva Conventions and other war crimes, civilians' deaths, looting of property and produce. We hear about regularly about the wheat and shipping of food products from Ukraine being blocked by Russia, mass killings, mass graves, targeting of civilian infrastructure, rape used as a weapon of war, these so-called and ominous filtration camps, forced deportation, ongoing war crimes investigations, and then most recently in The Guardian, a report on cremation centers in occupied Ukraine, where bodies of both Russian soldiers and Ukrainians are simply cremated. None of this, obviously, in the history of warfare is new. And if we'd been here in the 1940s, all of these things were occurring, and we're aware of the depravities of armies in this type of situation. But these are being reported on, and why we gathered the speakers we have today is in order to inform you as best as we can about the situation on the ground from eminent speakers that have really been organized to speak today about these issues. I'm going to unshare my screen and introduce Dr. Nelia Manichuk, who without her involvement wouldn't have been able to put this together through her network in Ukraine. Nelia, take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, everybody, for joining our speakers who will be speaking on war crimes against healthcare workers and also attacks on healthcare facilities, as this is obviously an interest to our community and we want to learn how we can help. As Mark mentioned, I am Nelia Melnichuk. I am surgeon at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. You already have seen me on the prior webinars, and my group is involved in humanitarian aid to Ukraine and strengthening healthcare system. And we are very grateful for the whole community and very grateful for the speakers for joining us. We have Pavlo Kovtoniuk, Alexandra Matveychuk, and Jane Buchanan. And we will start with Pavlo Kovtoniuk, who is a co-founder of Ukrainian Healthcare Center, a nonprofit think tank on health systems in Ukraine. In the last 5 years, Pavlo Kovtoniuk was consultant for WHO Health Systems Office. He was also a deputy minister of health in Ukraine and was a part of the team who started radical healthcare reform in Ukraine. His organization actually has been working really hard to document all the attacks on healthcare facilities, and he will share with us what he learned so far and how we can help. Thank you, Pavlo.
Thank you, Nelia, and thank you for having me here. I will probably start with saying that I would never imagine that I will be on a webinar like this, speaking about things like this, about hospital attacks, which I was kind of forced to start documenting in my life. Actually, I'm a person with a background in health management. I work as a deputy minister of health. Back in 2016, we made a huge health reform in Ukraine, really big and radical one, implemented single-payer system, universal health care in the country, made a lot in primary care, in many other things. And later, after quitting ministry, I founded my own organization, actually promoting reform processes and transformation processes here in Ukraine in order to modernize our country in our aspirations to integrate into European Union and generally into the kind of civilized Western world, as we call it in Ukraine. But then kind of the life changed quite dramatically. It happened this year, February 24. Of course, I remember this day very well. I was in my flat in Kyiv, 5 a.m. in the morning. I heard very loud explosions because I live in a place near 2 large airfields where Russian paratroopers were attempting to land in the very first day of invasion. Mark showed you the today's front line in the east and in the south, but at the very beginning, Russians advanced from all of directions, except probably for the western part of the country. So that was a large-scale invasion. And the first explosions happened in many places, including near my home. And yeah, that was, I don't want to, remember that time, but many people and myself, we are trying to do only one thing, to get our families into safety. I have a small kid and my wife, we jumped into the car and moved to the western part of the country and tried to settle down there. And actually it took some time for us to find a place to be there. And then initial plan was that I will be back to Kyiv, but the situation evolved in a way that it was hardly possible, because Kyiv at that time was half encircled and there was a possibility that it will be fully encircled. And I decided to stay in Lviv, in the western part of the country, because I understood that in an event of encirclement of my home city of Kyiv, there will be no use of me being there. And also in Lviv, I was able to reassemble the part of my team, and we decided we should do something for the country and for the war at that time. And one of the things we were doing, except for volunteering and doing all the other stuff, was just intuitively to fixing the events of attacks on health facilities, which we found in the news. So we would just kind of automatically started to fill a kind of Excel spreadsheet on that. And we didn't know at that time that it will grow into the large project, large direction in our work, which we are currently doing in Ukraine and on documenting hospital attacks, on which I want to tell you more. When Russians retreated from Kyiv, and it happened in early April, on April 7th, they retreated. I took my wife and I took my family, and we decided we want to get back to our city. It was very scary, and that was not a very user-friendly place to live at that time, kind of post-apocalypse, city. But we decided we need to be there together with our home and together with our city, and we moved back. And what I started to do, and a couple of people who from my team of Ukraine Healthcare Center who were also back to the city, we started not only to document attacks on health facilities from the open sources, but we started to visit the places. So we jumped into our cars and we started to go all around the Kyiv Oblast and nearby oblasts. Oblast is a region, right? In order to write stories, right? To recreate the stories of these potential war crimes, many of which are real war crimes. And I will tell you later why. And one of the places which I visited first was this place, which you can see on the screen. This is a primary care center in the small town of Makariv, 20 kilometers from Bucha, which you probably know about, and 40 kilometers from Kyiv. Makariv was never occupied because it was very well defended, and Russians didn't manage to penetrate it, unlike Bucha and unlike Irpin. But it was also a scene of appalling war crimes. First of all, it was kind of indiscriminate and chaotic shelling of the town. And one of the places which was hit was this primary care center. Why this center? Because when I was Deputy Minister of Health, I visited this place because this place was built during the health reform we were promoting. And that was one of many primary care centers which were built from the scratch, the new centers in small communities which increased access for people to primary care. And I opened the center actually. And by the way, during the COVID pandemic, it was the vaccination site, mass vaccination center. And you can see here the sign saying vaccinate, get your vaccine here, right? Because that was, for this small community, it was a vaccination place. So I read in the news about this center, and again I jumped into my car with my colleagues and we went onto the site, and what we saw was this. This is the video I made on this center. We found this place totally obliterated, totally demolished to the ground. What was interesting about this scene is that all the nearby territory was also hit by some artillery or whatever, but the picture of this was very different. And this center was clearly distinguished, had a very distinguished picture, right, of attack. After which we made a conclusion that this primary care center was targeted, right? It was not kind of collateral damage, but somebody would intentionally do that. And we started to investigate. It was our first investigation. We started to investigate into that case, and we found out that we saw a clear picture of a very important type of attacks, which is called targeted attacks. When the Russian troops saw what was it and targeted it intentionally. And they did it with this type of weapon, which is called mortar. Unfortunately, now I need to know about all this type of weapons. You probably don't know that, and lucky you that you don't. I do. And we got to know about it because we found all the traces of this very highly probable war crime. We found these holes from mortar shells situated one from another at a distance approximately 10 meters, it's kind of 30 feet, right? And that said to us that that was mortar fire because that was corrected. So mortar fire, you make shots from about 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers, and then you correct the fire. There is another person who is watching in the binocular or from the drone and says to the person who is firing that make one step further and then make one step further. And we found 5 actually corrections. They needed actually 6 attempts until they finally hit this place. What is more important is that they saw what they were hitting because they had this spotter and they had also people who knew perfectly well that they're shelling the primary care facility, the healthcare facility clearly designated. So there are at least 5 people in the team in this brigade of mortar who did that, and one of them was commander, the other was spotter, and they knew what they did. We also identified the potential place of this fire, and hopefully soon we will also identify the unit and the names of the perpetrators. Then we started to travel all around the country, especially in the north, and we found other patterns of attacks. One of them, the most common one in Ukraine, was indiscriminate bombing. Is when you don't actually target specific object, but you bomb everything you see in front of you in hope, I don't know, whatever hope they had. But in this case, which I'm going to tell you about, there was no justifiable or reasonable target for that. That is the city of Chernihiv, north to Kyiv, 300,000 population, quite a big and beautiful city. And then on March 3, in 20 p.m., the plane flew over this place and dropped 8 large unguided bombs, called dumb bombs, because they cannot be guided in any specific direction. They just fall at a very approximate place, you cannot target anything with them. And the plane dropped at least 8 bombs on the city center of Chernihiv. 2 bombs were dropped into the yard of the cardiac center, the regional cardiac center, and this center was actually demolished, and you can see it on your screen. But even more horrific is that the nearby apartment buildings and residential houses were also heavily affected. We actually were able to identify all of those bombs from the dashcam video which we obtained, and we recreated also the whole scene of the attack. And 4 apartment buildings, large apartment buildings, were affected. 47 people were killed by this plane, by this pilot, and those people mostly were outside in the queue to the pharmacy, waiting in the morning, and and most of them died because of that shelling. No military objects, no other justified objects could not be identified whatsoever. That was just a random dropping bombs in the very city center. Moreover, we found another pattern of attack, which is especially horrific pattern, which is use of cluster munitions. Cluster munitions are prohibited by the international law, by the special convention, because cluster munitions are designed to kill people indiscriminately. So they are designed for that. This is a munition which is then opens and sub-munitions fly out of this, and then they explode, and then shrapnel of these sub-munitions kills everyone around. And those cluster munitions were used multiple times in Chernihiv Oblast especially, and also in Kharkiv. Here to the right you can see one of the villages near Chernihiv where we identified the remnants of cluster munitions. This is me holding the remnants of cluster munitions. And here is the place, the children's hospital, the regional children's hospitals with kids inside, which was attacked indiscriminately by cluster munition. I remind you, this is the munition designed to kill people indiscriminately in large amounts. And this is the 5th floor to the right. You can see the photo, 5th floor, a hole in the window and a piece of shrapnel, which hit more than 200 of windows in this hospital. Luckily, 10 minutes before this, the air raid siren was over. It was this attack was without air raid siren, without any sign of the attack approaching. But before that, in the morning, there was an air raid alert, and children were in the basement, and they didn't come to their wards yet before this attack came. That was luck, and that was a miracle that all the kids remained alive. But in the nearby area, at least 3 children were heavily injured, and also a lot of adults. And this hospital would admit both kids and adults. And these are pictures from the director of this hospital, and also the shrapnel they took out of the people actually who were admitted to this hospital. What I can say to you in conclusion? In conclusion, I can say that the most frequent question I receive when I tell the stories, and this is the only small proportion of the stories we gathered, most of the people ask me, and most of the journalists ask me, why? Why do you think Russians are doing that? And I think in order to answer this question, we don't need to go through these cases one by one. You need to see the larger pattern. And the larger pattern is the following, that those attacks are really, really massive. 189 attacks we have fixed from the beginning of the invasion. 164, most of them happened during the first phase of the invasion before I came to Kyiv in the first 42 days of the invasion. That means that 4 to 6 attacks on hospitals happened every day. So this is all you need to know about why, and about what happened. What happened was a deliberate and massive destruction of healthcare sphere in Ukraine. When healthcare sector is destroyed so massively, there is a consequences for that. And the main consequence for that is insecurity. The huge insecurity, because hospitals are a special place which is operating even during the war, and people need to feel secure there. But when you attack hospitals en masse, people feel insecure, profoundly insecure, and they start to flee. And Mark showed you the largest since World War II number of refugees which the European continent observed. And this has the name. This tactic has a name, and the name is terror. When you use civilian objects and civilian livelihoods as a means of warfare in order to create insecurity and in order to create people fleeing, it is called terror. And the perpetrator who is doing terror is called terrorist. But why terror? Why it happens? It happens because of impunity, because Russia has done that before in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Ukraine in 2014, and in Syria. And in order to get the understanding of that, just look at these statistics. The coalition forces in Syria, including the US, committed attacks on hospitals, 4 attacks in all of the years of presence there. ISIS committed 10 attacks. Russia committed 244 attacks. So already in Syria, they used hospitals, they used healthcare as not as a collateral, victim of the warfare, but as a means of warfare. But we did nothing, And this impunity was showed in Ukraine. The guy who bombed the Chernihiv city center on March 3 and the cardiac center was actually taken prisoner because his plane was down and he was taken prisoner. And what the Ukrainian security services have found is that he did that in Syria, actually. And you can see his picture to the left, together with Bashar Assad, the dictator of Syria, and together with Vladimir Putin, and together with Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister of Russia. So what we should do, and this is my last slide. First of all, we should understand what we see and what we encounter. And we encounter terror, and we encounter the terrorist state. And the world and the United States must recognize that. Second, in order to come out of it as a civilized people, we should militarily and politically defeat these terrorists. Just imagine if Russia wins this war, what will happen then? That would be a disaster. Then third, we need to protect the fundamental values, including that healthcare should be safe. And I can make another whole lecture on that international organizations, including the World Health Organizations, miserably failed in doing that. And last but not least is justice. One day or the other, the justice should be implemented, but it only can happen if Russia will be defeated militarily and politically. Thank you for your attention. That's all from my side. Over to you guys.
Nelia, tremendous. Thank you, Pavlo, very much. Nelia, if you want to take it away, introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Pavlo, so much for shining a light for us on all of the attacks. And it's very important for all of us, for all of our participants, to learn about it. I mean, we are all physicians, we can be in the same shoes. And Ukraine, important to understand that Ukraine in independence right now, but also for the whole world. So we need to listen to this, learn about it, and do everything we can to help. Our next speaker is Alexandra Matveychuk, who is a human rights defender who works on human rights issues in Ukraine. At present, she heads human rights organization Center for Civil Liberties in Ukraine. And one of the activities of the Center for Civil Liberties in Ukraine is to protect human rights and also to document war crimes against during current invasion by Russia. And we will ask Alexandra to speak about war crimes against healthcare. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. My name is Alexandra Matveychuk. For over 20 years, I have been defending human rights in Ukraine and OSCE region. And the recent 8 years, I have been documenting war crimes. Since Russian full-scale invasion in February this year, we have united dozens of human rights organizations into the Tribunal for Putin initiative. Only in 5 months of Russia's aggression, jointly we have documented over 13,000 criminal episodes. And this is the reasons why I can confidently assert the following. First, Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. Russia causes great suffering and pain to civilian population in order to petrify people's will to resist and occupy the independent state. This is a conscious policy of the Russian leadership. Russian military intentionally ruin residential dwellings, churches, hospitals, schools, They apply indiscriminated weapons in densely populated regions. Russia's facilitate filtration camp systems in occupied territories and commit massive deportation of Ukrainian population. Second, Russian army persecutes and terrorizes civilians, aiming to keep its control over the occupied territories. Russians abduct, torture, rape, and kill civilians despite their gender or age. They intentionally exterminate local active people like mayor, local deputies, journalists, human rights defenders, civil activists, lawyers, volunteers, priests, artists, and others. And third, Russian army and Russian top military and top political officials have no respect to the role of doctors and other medical workers who try to help wounded and sick combatants or even civilians. And we recorded cases when Russians deliberately attack medical personnel when they try to provide medical assistance to people. Russian army, in violation of IHL, arrested and hold doctors and other medical workers as prisoners of the war. The case of military physicians Victoria Abidina is a good illustration of this situation. She was arrested and separated with her 4-year-old daughter during the humanitarian evacuation from Azovstal plant in May this year, despite that fact that humanitarian evacuation was organized under the guarantee of UN and ICRC. Also, Russian army destroyed medical infrastructure. I can cite as an example of a systematic study by our colleague, Human Rights Organization Alternative. They prepared a report on the destruction of medical facilities from February to the end of May 2022. And according to their data, only this one human rights organization recorded 65 incidents of Russian military shelling of healthcare facilities on the territory of Ukraine. At the same time, the organization didn't find a single case of the presence of military personnel in these hospitals. I just want to make emphasis on it in regard of the recent amnesty release. Moreover, there is no information about the presence of military bases on this territory of hospitals. So it's like a real situation in which I found myself and millions of Ukrainians live for current moment, trying to fight for a freedom to be Ukrainians, because this war have a colonies aspect, and a freedom to have our democratic choice, because it's not only a war between two countries, it's a war between two systems, like authoritarianism and democracy. And this is which provide me a bravery to call the world not to be indifferent to the situation and to involve in it. Because when we speak about civilizational battle, which have a value dimension, I'm, as a human rights defender, but first of all, as a human being, believe that active people who believe in freedom, in human rights and human dignity have to step in this situation. And in this regard, I would like to provide several recommendations which has to be done in this situation. And first and foremost, when we describe this horrible atrocities which we with other colleagues are documented, we need to stop it. And in order to stop it, maybe it's very weird to hear from the human rights lawyer, but I will tell you that we need a long-range distance weapons, and we need such level of economical sanctions which can stop the ability of Russian economy to feed this war. Because Putin will stop only when he will be stopped. Second, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm a human rights lawyer. But I see enormous suffering of civilian population. Sometimes it seems to me that we're not recording war crimes under Article 8 of Rome Statute of International Criminal Court or some violation of Geneva and Hague Convention. I feel that we recorded a pure human pain. And this means that Russia used this pain as an instrument, how to break people's resistance and to occupy the country, how to impose this learned helplessness across Ukrainian civilians. And this is also a task for people who can deal with trauma in a professional way. And we really need support and different kind of programs and different kind of assistance to help Ukrainians to heal the trauma, generally to population and some most vulnerable groups. I, for 8 years, work with the people who survived in captivity, and this is one of such kind of groups which I can mention, who were very severely tortured, physically and psychologically, because I spoke with people who were raped, whose fingers were cut, whose eyes were pulled out with a spoon, who were smashed into wooden boxes or tortured by electricity. And now, unfortunately, this practice is widespread to the new occupied by Russian territories. So psychological assistance to help Ukrainians to heal the trauma is very important. Third, my colleagues present his own experience, very bright one, how Russia tried to ruin deliberately and intentionally medical infrastructure. So we need assistance to strengthen the capacity of medical infrastructure, because despite the war, people have another kind of illnessness that have to be treated. And this is a huge problem for the whole Ukraine for current moment, especially in some other areas, which are under the constant attack or the battles are going on. And it can be done on a level even of hospitals, because there is a lot of things which have no limitation in national borders, and human solidarity is such kind of thing. So we need such programs of mentoring of concrete hospitals, when one hospital abroad can take like a mentorship of another hospital in Ukraine and provide facilities, exchange program, trainings, or something like this, working directly, like people to people, which is much more easier and faster in my point of view. And last but not the least, I would totally support my previous colleague Pavlo in his demand for justice. Because this is a pattern of behavior of Russian army, which we now clearly see on example of a medical sphere and the fate of doctors, physicians, and other kind of medical workers in this war. Russia used war crimes and committed war crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Syria, in Mali, in Libya, and have never been punished for that. Russians have even never been punished for using chemical weapons against civilians in Syria. And they enjoyed impunity for decades. And this put them to the thought that they can do whatever they wanted with the human beings. And this is a real danger, not only for Ukrainians, but for the whole world. Because if we will not be able to stop Putin in Ukraine, he will go further. And we will never know in which next country Russia decided to use a war as a tool how to reach geopolitical goal, and in which next country Russia will use war crimes as the methods how to win this war. So we need to break the circle of impunity. We need to hold perpetrators accountable. And it's not the topic of our seminar for current moment, but I will tell you that there is a gap of accountability, because national system have a very limited potential of investigation of these crimes, and International Criminal Court will limit itself to investigate only several ones, but is still a important task which we have to put on the table. I will stop here and will be glad to answer to a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, so much for this. And I totally agree with your message. And I do feel that our Harvard community needs to do more. We are the biggest healthcare center in Boston. We have means, and we can do more here as well, in addition to what has been done already. Our next speaker is Jane Buchanan, who is an independent human rights investigator, educator, and advocate. She worked as Human Rights Watch for 17 years, including as a deputy director for disability rights. During her 17-year career as a Human Rights Watch, she initiated organizational work in Ukraine in 2002 and conducted multiple investigations into human rights violations in 25 countries, including the armed. Thank you, Jane.
Great, thank you so much. So I just want to thank everyone, and I'm extremely honored to be here. And I come with a tremendous amount of humility in the face of the experience of Alexandra, Pavlo, and all of your compatriots, and obviously all of the essential and crucial work that you do. I was invited to give a bit of perspective on the situation for persons with disabilities in terms of this conflict. So I'll be in the human rights and humanitarian context for this particularly at-risk group. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to try to share my screen here with a few slides I've prepared. Okay, is that visible?
Yeah, it's up.
Okay,
yep.
Great, okay. So I'll just start with a little bit of framing here. So on the profile of people with disabilities in Ukraine. So human rights activists and persons with disabilities approach disability through the conceptualization that disability arises from physical, social, and attitudinal barriers in society that prevent people from enjoyment of all aspects of their life on an equal basis with others. So this is a bit different from approaching people with disabilities as those who should be managed, taken care of, or fixed. Disability and diversity of disability are a fundamental part of the human condition. And with that, I wanted to start my presentation by sharing this photo of a representative Ukrainian organization, a person with disabilities. Yura, he's a wheelchair user. He has been involved in the humanitarian response and the human rights response as a person with disabilities. I should also say that the work that I do and much of the work that's here is really on the shoulders and through the amazing work of countless organizations and individuals with disabilities in Ukraine, persons who have fled Ukraine and working in other countries to defend the rights of persons with disabilities in Ukraine. But just a little bit of background, as of 2020, so prior to Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine in February this year, there were an estimated 6 million people with disabilities in Ukraine. So these are people with sensory, physical, intellectual, and psychosocial disabilities, and those with multiple disabilities. Among them are many older people who have been very visible in this conflict. About 25% of Ukraine's population is older. We know that the prevalence of disability increases with age. The Ukrainian government has had policies and initiatives in place for many years to combat discrimination, increase accessibility, because we know that in all countries around the world, there remains stigma, discrimination, and lack of accessibility for people with disabilities in different spheres. Before I talk about the situation, in the recent months, is just to make note that obviously there's been ongoing conflict and occupation in Eastern Ukraine and in Crimea since 2014, when Russia first invaded. The result has been death, injury, destruction, and widespread human rights abuses in those areas. At least 1.5 million people displaced from 2014 to 2022, and about 5% of them are persons with disabilities. All right, so Russian military attacks and disability. So this war, as our colleagues have said, has been characterized by deliberate Russian military bombing, missile, artillery, and other attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. This creates particular dangers for people with disabilities, and it also increases the prevalence of disability. So for example, we have seen images of people taking refuge in or living in basements, metro stations, and other locations as seeking protection from bombing and other attacks. Unfortunately, these types of shelters are often not accessible to people with physical disabilities. In some cases, information about shelters may not be accessible for them and places them at greater risk than others who may be able to access shelters. So an unknown number, but surely in the tens, hundreds of thousands have been badly injured, including with the loss of limbs, hearing, sight, or burns by bombs, missiles, and other weapons. Others have been harmed by attacks, direct attacks, violence, sexual violence, and torture by Russian forces occupying parts of Ukraine. And the lasting and psychosocial harm of these abuses, as well as uncertainty about the future and the lack of access to basic necessities, is also a grave concern, and it increases as the war goes on. So in the light of the attacks on medical facilities, medical infrastructure, medical personnel, and doctors, it raises concerns about the long-term consequence for people with disabilities and people with newly acquired disabilities. So particularly brutal in this war, as Pablo mentioned, has been the Russian military's use of certain types of weapons, their regular and consistent use, including cluster munitions. We heard from Pablo the impact of those munitions and their indiscriminate nature. One of the other features of them is that if they don't explode upon impact, they effectively become landmines, which can explode on contact or indiscriminately. Russian forces have also regularly used other types of weapons that are banned. These are anti-personnel landmines, anti-vehicle landmines, both of which that can kill and lead to serious bodily injury. Russian forces have also placed victim-activated booby traps in homes, yards, roads, and agricultural areas when withdrawing from occupied areas. When people touch these or when they explode indiscriminately, this results in death and serious injury. In light of the conflict and the attacks and the nature of the attacks, there have been a lot of people who have sought to evacuate and have been forced to flee their homes for their own lives and safety and that of their families. So in addition to what Mark shared at the beginning, the current UN data estimates that a total of at least 13 million people in Ukraine have fled their homes. About half have fled Ukraine to other countries where they have sought refuge. The other half are displaced in other parts of Ukraine. The need for evacuation is ongoing. Most recently, we know that the Ukrainian government has called on people to evacuate parts of Eastern Ukraine. These calls for evacuation have been ongoing when there's known escalation in conflict, and evacuations are underway. Many people are able to flee on their own or through government or other organized evacuation systems. However, people with disabilities may face particular barriers. In some cases, they cannot independently reach train or bus stations or collective sites for evacuation. They require support services to get them there. Information may not be accessible for people with different types of disabilities or for people who may not have access to or utilize phones or the internet. So here I just have a few images from the Ukrainian Disability Rights Organization. It's an organization of persons with disabilities, women-led organization who do evacuations. Here they're evacuating people with specialized transport, including a person who needed to be evacuated lying down. I'll just also mention the situation of residential institutions. Unfortunately, large numbers of children and adults do continue to live in residential institutions for persons with disabilities, particularly in the East. It's a legacy of the Soviet Union. And these present particular challenges for evacuations because some of those institutions are quite large with several hundred people in them. Now for the situation for people who are unable to or choose not to flee. People who remain in insecure areas may not be able to access food, water, medicines, or healthcare regularly or at all. Other items in humanitarian parlance, these are non-food items. These are things for persons with disabilities that are essential for their dignity, their health and well-being, such as adult diapers or incontinence pads. These are in short supply and are desperately needed. Many people who have fled or in different experiences of the conflict have lost or had their assistive products damaged. These include wheelchairs, walkers, hearing aids, and glasses. I want to note that in many of these areas where people with disabilities or others who remain in insecure areas, unable to evacuate, may not be able to access essentials. There are extremely dynamic, brave volunteer networks and smaller organizations who are reaching them and supporting them, as well as government agencies. For those who are displaced, there are also barriers to accessing aid. The humanitarian response overwhelmingly concentrates aid in centralized areas. Again, people with disabilities, it may not be able to reach those centralized points, either because they don't have support to get there, they may not have information. Aid that is being provided sometimes is not fit for purpose. This can be in the types of food and the nutritional requirements. We see many times in conflicts around the world that there can be a shipment of hospital wheelchairs. We all have an image of what that is in our mind, but these are essentially not usable actually by a person with a disability. A wheelchair must be fit to the person and meet their different physical and other requirements. So in terms of the way forward, the humanitarian response must be rights respecting. It must reach all of those, including those who are the most marginalized. We see increased recognition of persons with disabilities and their particular needs and the barriers for them to access aid and services, but this needs to be consistent and comprehensive. The most important aspect is really the active participation, leadership, and inclusion of people with disabilities, not only in the humanitarian response, but in documenting and participating in investigations of war crimes, justice mechanisms that we all hope and desire to happen. On the right here is an image of a man named Sashko. He has intellectual disabilities. He received glasses, which had been damaged and then lost by the conflict when he fled an area of active conflict, and he then subsequently became engaged in a humanitarian and human rights response. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Jane, thank you very much indeed. We keep these webinars strictly to time, but I could see that there's a clear need to have your back and do a kind of more of a Q&A and discussion as well. I want to thank everybody who's contributed this, particularly to Dr. Nelia Melnichuk, who really helped us put this together, and invite Pavlo and Alexandra, Jane, to speak today. I think we've done what the mission of this was, to bring the full view of what is happening with regards to the Ukrainian healthcare crisis to our colleagues here in healthcare in Boston. And I appreciate all those who've been online today throughout the hour, listening to the courageous and very clear words that Pavlo, Alexandra, and Jane were saying about what the situation is in Ukraine currently and the way forward with regards to the help support that is needed to win Ukraine back into the free world and out of this cauldron that the Russian army and leadership system has put it into. I just want to make one other point here, which is that every little bit helps here. From this webinar all the way to masses of medical relief from organizations like Nelia that runs the Global Medical Knowledge Alliance, to Autism Unity, to all the NGOs that are currently operating there in concert with Alexandra and Pavlo. I'm sure there are other organizations that should be mentioned here. There's those who provide financial resources here, like Lake Country Medical Aid to Ukraine, that has been working with us to support actual material medical relief to the front lines in Eastern Ukraine. And anyone on this call, I'm sure, would be available to contact our speakers today if they want to offer help here. So every little bit helps. We learned that not personally, but certainly from family knowledge during the Second World War, that no act is too small here to support Ukraine and Ukrainians rebuild, recover, and repel the attacks on its freedom-loving society at this current time. So I want to thank all of the participants in the webinar for their participation today, and all of those who listened in to hear precisely what is going on in Ukraine today, as up to date as possible. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Pavlo. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Nelia. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.